You have 30 seconds to explain why my mother's signature is on a will none of us have ever seen. That was my Uncle Franklin, standing in the middle of a lawyer's office, red in the face, pointing at a piece of paper that was about to change everything. I want you to sit with that for a second. 20 years of being told I didn't belong. 20 years of empty chairs at family tables, quiet insults at holidays, cousins who wouldn't say my name out loud. And then one piece of paper undid all of it in under a minute. I think about karma a lot differently now than I used to. I used to believe it was something you waited for, something that happened to other people while you kept your head down and survived. I don't believe that anymore. I believe karma is just patience wearing a disguise. It doesn't rush, it watches, and when it finally moves, it moves all at once. Hey, before I go further, tell me where you're watching this from. Tell me what the weather's like where you are right now, because where I was sitting, in that office, the weather didn't matter anymore. Nothing outside that room mattered anymore. My name is Olivia. This is the story of how I went from being the girl nobody wanted at the table to being the only person at the table who mattered. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, you know exactly what I'm about to tell you is going to hurt before it heals, so stay with me. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because trust me, this is only the beginning. But let me start from the beginning. 20 years back, when I was still a girl who thought love was something you earned by trying hard enough. I was 6 when my father died. I don't remember much about him, just the smell of his jacket and the sound of his laugh in home videos I watched too many times growing up. What I do remember clearly is what happened after. My mother and I moved out of the family estate within a month. Nobody asked us to stay. Nobody offered to help. My grandmother, the matriarch of the family, the one who controlled everything, said nothing to stop it. I grew up believing that was normal. I believed families quietly discarded the parts of themselves they didn't need anymore, the same way you'd clean out a closet. My mother worked 2 jobs. I babysat neighborhood kids for extra cash starting at 12. I learned early that nothing in my life would be handed to me, so I stopped expecting it to be. Here's the detail I want you to remember, because it's going to matter later. Every single Sunday, without missing one, I visited my grandmother, not because she asked me to, not because anyone in the family knew or cared. I visited her because she was the only piece of my father I had left, and because underneath the cold, unreachable woman everyone else saw, I always believed there was someone still in there who was lonely. My cousins called it strange. My aunts called it desperate. One of them, Aunt Corinne, told me once, right to my face, that I visited grandmother out of hope for money and that everyone could see through it. I didn't argue, I just kept showing up. I want you to hold on to that, because in a few minutes, you're going to understand exactly why it mattered more than any of them ever imagined. By the time I turned 26, I had built a small life for myself. Nothing extravagant, a 1-bedroom apartment, a job I didn't hate, enough saved up to feel steady instead of scared. I stopped needing anything from that family a long time before this story starts. That's important too. I want you to know I wasn't there for what came next. I never saw it coming. 3 weeks ago, my grandmother passed away in her sleep. I found out through a text message from my mother, not from anyone in the family itself. That alone told me everything about where I stood. The funeral was small, private, family only, though I use that term loosely considering how they'd always treated me. I went to say goodbye to the only person in that family who ever let me sit beside her without conditions. I didn't go expecting anything else. 2 days after the funeral, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man introduced himself as Gerald Whitmore, my grandmother's longtime family lawyer, someone I'd only met a handful of times growing up, always in passing, always looking at me like he knew something none of us did. He asked me to come to his office for the reading of the will. I laughed when he said it. I actually laughed, because I assumed there had to be a mistake, that maybe he meant to invite my mother, or maybe this was some formality they extended to everyone who attended the funeral. I told him as much. He didn't laugh back. His voice went quiet and steady, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. He said, "Olivia, I need you there. It's not a formality." That's where I'll leave this part of the story for now. Because what happened in that office 3 days later is the reason I'm sitting here telling you all of this. It's the reason my uncle screamed at a piece of paper. It's the reason an entire family that spent 20 years pretending I didn't exist was about to learn my name the hard way. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. 12 chairs were set up in front of a wide mahogany desk, and every single one of them was already filled by the time I walked in. My uncles, my aunts, cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, all of them dressed like they were attending a business merger instead of a funeral reading. Nobody said hello. Aunt Corinne looked me up and down the way she always did, like she was pricing an item she had no intention of buying. My cousin Desmond didn't even look up from his phone. I found the only open seat, in the back corner, and sat down quietly, the way I'd learned to do at every family gathering since I was 6. Gerald Whitmore stood at the front of the room holding a thick envelope, sealed, with a date on it that made several people in the room shift in their seats. It was dated 8 months before my grandmother's death. Nobody had known this version existed. "This will supersede any previous documents," Gerald said. "Your mother updated her estate plan privately, without informing counsel until she was ready. I only opened this envelope 48 hours ago, per her instructions." My Uncle Franklin sat forward immediately. "Get on with it, Gerald. We've all got places to be." I want to tell you what I was thinking in that moment, because it matters. I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about the business, or the estate, or any of the things that had clearly kept this family orbiting my grandmother for decades. I was thinking about Sunday afternoons, about bringing her tea the way she liked it, too strong, no sugar, about the way she used to hold my hand without saying anything, like the silence between us said enough. I'll take you back briefly, so you understand how deep this went before the will was ever read. For 20 years, my place in this family had been decided for me before I ever had a say in it. When I was 8, my aunt told me directly that I would never be considered a real member of the family, because my mother wasn't one of us, and my father was gone. When I was 14, I wasn't invited to my own cousin's birthday party, held at the family estate, 2 miles from where my mother and I were renting a small apartment. When I turned 18, there was no card, no call, nothing, while every other grandchild received a car. I built a habit early on of expecting nothing, because expecting nothing meant nothing could be taken from me. That's the quiet trade you make when you grow up unwanted. You stop reaching for things so people can't watch you fail to catch them. But every Sunday, I still went to see her, even when she was sharp with me, even when she barely spoke, even during the years she seemed to look through me like I was a stranger passing through her home. I didn't go for approval. I went because somewhere in me, I still believed she was the only thread connecting me to a father I couldn't remember, and because I refused to let her be as alone as everyone else in that family had made me feel. Nobody in that room knew any of that. Nobody had asked. Gerald broke the seal. He read through the preliminary legal language first, the kind that makes a room go quiet out of confusion rather than respect. Then he reached the part that mattered. "To my son Franklin, my daughter Corinne, and my remaining children," he read, "I leave a one-time settlement of $200,000 each, and nothing further." The room didn't react right away. I think it took a few seconds for the words to actually land, the way bad news sometimes needs a moment before it becomes real. "The remainder of my estate," Gerald continued, "including full ownership of Wyndham Holdings, all subsidiary companies, all real estate assets, and controlling shares of the family trust, I leave in their entirety to my granddaughter, Olivia." Silence, then noise, then chaos. Franklin was on his feet first, his chair scraping hard against the floor. "That's impossible! Read it again!" Corinne's voice cracked through the room, sharp and furious. She manipulated her. She's been manipulating her for years, visiting her, playing the victim, and now this? This is fraud. I sat frozen in the back of the room, while people who had spent 2 decades pretending I didn't exist suddenly couldn't stop looking at me. Desmond finally put his phone down. Someone I didn't even recognize started crying. Another cousin demanded the will be contested immediately, right there, before we'd even left the building. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My hands were shaking in my lap, and every part of me was waiting for someone to explain that this was a mistake, that Gerald had misread a name, that there was another Olivia somewhere who actually deserved this. Gerald raised his hand, and something in the calm authority of the gesture quieted the room enough for him to speak again. "There's a letter," he said. "She asked me to read it aloud, in the event this reaction occurred, and she was very specific that it would." He reached into the envelope and pulled out a second, smaller document, handwritten, unmistakably in my grandmother's script. Franklin scoffed. "Read it then. Let's hear her excuse for cutting out her own children." Gerald looked at the paper for a moment, then at the room, then began to read. "If you are hearing this," he read, "then you are angry, and I understand why. You built your lives around an inheritance you assumed would always be yours. I let you believe that, for longer than I should have, because I wanted to see who you would become without the promise of my money shaping your choices." The room had gone still in a different way now, not shocked, bracing. "For 20 years," Gerald continued reading, "I watched each of you circle me like my death was an event to prepare for, rather than a person to know. You brought me business updates instead of company. You brought me holiday photos taken for optics instead of memories made with me in them. I was lonely in a house full of people who only visited when they needed something signed. I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't known any of that. I had assumed, all those years, that she simply didn't need anyone, that she was as unreachable with them as she often seemed with me. Then there was Olivia," Gerald read, and my name in her handwriting, spoken aloud in that room, hit me harder than I expected. The one grandchild the rest of you decided wasn't worth claiming. The one who came every single Sunday for over a decade, not once asking me for anything. She brought me tea. She sat with me in silence when I had nothing to say. She never once mentioned the business, the money, or the estate. She was the only person in this family who treated me like her grandmother instead of her inheritance." Corinne's face had gone pale. Franklin wasn't moving at all. "So I made my decision," Gerald finished. "Everything I built goes to the only one of you who ever built anything with me instead of around me. I love all of you, but love was never enough to earn what greed made you forget how to deserve." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Franklin turned to me, and for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't looking through me. He was looking directly at me, and what I saw in his face wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. Fear looks different on people who have never had to feel it before. Franklin's hands were shaking, but not from grief. He was doing the math in his head, the same math everyone else in that room was doing. 20 years of assuming the empire was theirs, gone in the span of one letter. "This isn't happening," Corinne said, her voice lower now, almost to herself. "She's a nobody. She's been a nobody this entire time." "That's enough," Gerald said, folding the letter closed. "The will is legally binding. It was drafted with full mental competency, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized 8 months ago. There is no version of a contest that succeeds here, and I'd strongly advise against trying." Desmond, my cousin, the one who hadn't looked up from his phone the entire meeting, finally spoke, and his voice had none of the venom the others carried. "Olivia, did you know about this?" I shook my head. My voice, when it finally came, was quieter than I wanted it to be. I had no idea. I didn't even know there was a new will. Nobody believed me at first. I watched it settle differently across each of their faces, disbelief turning into calculation, turning into something closer to desperation. These were people who had spent their entire adult lives being handed everything, and for the first time, they were being asked to consider the possibility that everything now depended on someone they'd spent 20 years discarding. I want to walk you through the next few days, because this is where it stopped being about a piece of paper and started becoming about who I actually was, underneath everything they'd decided about me. The calls started that same evening. Corinne first, her voice completely different than it had been in Gerald's office, soft now, careful, almost sweet in a way that felt more unsettling than her usual cruelty. She reminded me we were family. She reminded me blood mattered. She asked if we could meet for coffee, just the 2 of us, to talk things through like adults. I agreed, mostly out of habit. Old instincts don't disappear just because circumstances change. We met 2 days later. She hugged me when she arrived, which she had never done in 20 years, not once, Not even at my own mother's hospital bedside, years earlier, when she happened to be visiting someone else on the same floor and walked straight past us. "I know things have been complicated between us," she said, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't need sugar in. "But we're still family, Olivia, and family should help each other." I asked her what she meant. She explained, carefully, that the business required someone experienced to run it, someone who understood the industry, someone who had spent years around the operations. She suggested, gently, that I could remain the technical owner on paper while allowing the existing leadership, meaning her, meaning Franklin, meaning the people who had run the company into disputes and shareholder complaints for the last decade, to continue managing daily operations. I asked her a simple question. I asked her where that same concern for family had been every Christmas I spent alone with my mother while the rest of them gathered at the estate 2 miles away. She didn't have an answer for that. She just stared at her coffee like it had personally betrayed her. Franklin's approach came differently. He didn't ask for anything. He threatened instead, quietly, the way men who are used to controlling rooms tend to threaten things, without raising their voice at all. He told me the company's board would never accept me as a legitimate controlling owner. He told me I didn't understand what I'd inherited, that I would drown trying to run something this large, that the responsible thing, the mature thing, would be to sign management rights over to people who actually understood the business. I asked him a similarly simple question. I asked him if he remembered the year I turned 18, when every other grandchild received a car from grandmother and I received nothing. I asked if that absence had ever bothered him, even slightly, in the years since. He told me that wasn't relevant to the conversation. I told him it was the only thing relevant to this conversation. Here's what nobody in that family understood, and what I didn't fully understand myself until I sat with it during those long nights after the reading. My grandmother hadn't just left me a company, she'd left me proof. Proof that 20 years of feeling unworthy hadn't been the truth of who I was, only the truth of how they'd chosen to treat me. She'd watched all of it, quietly, from wherever she sat in that enormous house, and she'd made her decision long before any of us knew a decision needed to be made. The hardest part wasn't the anger from my family. I expected that. The hardest part was the guilt trip that followed it, dressed up as love, dressed up as second chances, dressed up as the family finally wanting to include me, now that inclusion came with something they wanted. My mother, when I told her everything, went quiet on the phone for a long moment before she said something I've held on to since. She said, "They didn't want you when you had nothing to offer them. Don't let them convince you that changes now that you do." I sat with that for days. I met with Gerald privately to understand exactly what I now controlled, what responsibilities came with it, what my grandmother had actually built beneath the surface tension the family had always projected outward. It was more than I understood. Hospitals funded quietly under a foundation with her name attached that none of the family ever mentioned. Scholarships for kids aging out of foster care, something my grandmother had never once spoken about to anyone in 20 years, something Gerald only knew because he'd handled the paperwork personally. She had spent decades building something that mattered, while her own children spent decades assuming the money was the only thing worth inheriting. 3 weeks after the reading, Franklin requested an emergency family meeting. Not with lawyers this time, just family, in the same room where he'd once screamed at a piece of paper, now asking to sit across from the person he'd spent 20 years erasing. I agreed to go, not because I owed them anything, but because I needed to see, with my own eyes, whether anything in that room had actually changed, or whether it was simply fear wearing the costume of remorse. The room felt smaller than it had 3 weeks earlier. Maybe it was the same size, and I was just seeing it differently now, without the fog of shock clouding every detail. They were all there again. Franklin at the head of the table this time, a position he'd claimed for himself out of habit, rather than right. Corinne beside him, Desmond, quieter than before, sitting slightly apart from the others like he hadn't fully decided which side of this conversation he belonged on. A few cousins I barely recognized filled the remaining chairs, their faces carrying the same calculation I'd seen in Gerald's office. Franklin started before I'd even sat down fully. We wanted to have an honest conversation, family to family, no lawyers, no letters, just us. I didn't say anything. I'd learned over the last 3 weeks that silence gave me more information than speaking ever had. We've had time to think, he continued, and we recognize that things haven't been fair to you. Growing up, we recognize that. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard from any of them in 20 years, and even now, it arrived wrapped in strategy rather than sincerity. Corinne leaned forward. We're not asking you to give anything up, Olivia. We just think, given everything, given the scale of what grandmother left you, it makes sense for the people who understand the business to help guide it. That's all we're asking. Guidance. I asked them directly. I asked if this guidance would have been offered if the will had left me nothing, the way everyone in that room had assumed it would. Nobody answered right away. I told them what I'd learned from Gerald. About the foundation grandmother had quietly funded for years, supporting hospitals and children aging out of foster care, without ever mentioning it to a single person in this family. I asked if any of them had known. They hadn't. Of course they hadn't. She'd built an entire second legacy, a quieter one that had nothing to do with the business empire they'd spent decades fighting over, and none of them had noticed, because none of them had ever asked her about anything beyond what she could give them. She was lonely, I said. For 20 years, she was lonely in a house full of people who only came around when they needed something. Franklin's jaw tightened. That's not fair. It's exactly fair, I said, because it's what she wrote in her own handwriting, in a letter she trusted me enough to have read aloud in a room full of people who spent my entire life making sure I understood I didn't belong in it. Desmond spoke up then, quieter than the rest. For what it's worth, I never agreed with how you were treated. I didn't do anything to stop it either. That's on me. It wasn't much, but it was more honesty than anyone else at that table had offered in 20 years, and I found myself grateful for it in a way I hadn't expected. Corinne tried a different approach, her voice softening into something almost pleading. We're scared, Olivia. This company employs hundreds of people. Families depend on it. If it fails under new leadership, that's not just our loss, it's theirs too. I understood the fear underneath that statement, even if I didn't fully trust the person saying it. I'd spent the last 3 weeks learning everything I could about what I now controlled, not because I wanted to prove anything to this family, but because grandmother had trusted me with something real, and I refused to let that trust go to waste, out of fear or spite. I'm not interested in punishing anyone, I said. I'm not interested in revenge or watching this company collapse to make a point, but I am the one grandmother chose. And going forward, decisions will be made by people who've earned trust through action, not people who assume they're owed a seat because of a last name. Franklin's expression hardened. So what? You're going to run us out? After everything this family built? This family didn't build it, I said. She did, alone mostly, from what I've read in the company's early records. You inherited positions in it. That's different from building something. The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Less shock, more reckoning. I told them my decision, the one I'd spent 3 weeks arriving at through long nights and quiet conversations with Gerald, and even longer conversations with myself. Franklin and Corinne would retain their current roles, under new oversight, with clear performance expectations that hadn't existed before, accountable to a board I would now have final say over. Desmond, given his honesty, would be given the opportunity to prove himself in a leadership role he'd never actually had before, since I'd learned he'd spent years being overlooked by his own parents in favor of appearances that mattered more to them than his actual capabilities. The foundation grandmother built quietly would no longer be quiet. I intended to expand it, publicly, in her name, the way she should have been recognized for it while she was alive. And I told them, clearly, that this wasn't about erasing them from the family the way I'd been erased. It was about building something none of us had actually had before, a family that showed up for each other without needing a will to force the question. Corinne started crying, and for the first time, I believed it wasn't performance. I don't know how to undo 20 years, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You just decide, from here forward, what kind of person you're going to be. That's all any of us can do. I stood up to leave. Franklin caught my arm gently before I reached the door. something he'd never done in my entire life. "For what it's worth," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "She talked about you more than any of us realized. We just weren't listening." I believed him, and for the first time in 20 years, I let myself feel something other than distance toward this family. 6 months passed before I felt like I recognized my own life again. The company steadied faster than anyone expected, including me. Franklin, to his credit, adjusted to oversight better than I imagined he would, though I think fear kept him honest more than growth did, at least in the beginning. Corinne surprised me the most. She started showing up to board meetings, prepared, engaged, asking questions about the employees themselves instead of only the numbers attached to them. I don't know if that change was permanent or convenient, but I chose to give her room to prove it either way. Desmond became the person I trusted most in that boardroom, which still catches me off guard some days. He ran the Western Division with a level of care I hadn't expected from someone I barely knew growing up. And slowly, carefully, we built something that resembled an actual working relationship, not built on obligation, but on the honesty he'd offered me that first day back at the table. The foundation grandmother built quietly for 20 years is quiet no longer. We expanded the scholarship program for kids aging out of foster care, and last month, we funded a new pediatric wing at the hospital she'd supported anonymously for over a decade. I put her name on the building. She deserved to be known for who she actually was, not just who the family assumed she was from a distance. I still visit the estate sometimes, alone, usually on Sundays, the same day I used to visit her all those years ago. I sit in the same chair, in the same quiet room, and I think about the version of myself who used to come here, expecting nothing, needing nothing, just wanting to make sure one person in this family wasn't as alone as I felt everywhere else. I think about karma differently than I explained at the start of this story. I used to think it meant waiting for the people who hurt you to eventually get what they deserved. Now I think it means something quieter than that. It means becoming the kind of person whose worth doesn't depend on who recognizes it. Grandmother spent 20 years watching quietly, deciding nothing based on anger, only on truth. I try to carry that forward, even on the hardest days with this family, even when old resentment tries to surface. Not everything is healed. I don't think it fully will be, and I've made peace with that. Corinne and I have coffee sometimes, and it's still careful, still measured, but it's real in a way it never used to be. Franklin and I will likely never be close, but we work together now with something that resembles respect instead of dismissal. Desmond and I talk every week, and some weeks, that friendship feels like the most unexpected gift to come out of all of this. My mother says I've changed since the will was read, though not in the way people usually mean when they say that. She says I stand differently now, like I finally believe I'm allowed to take up space in rooms I used to shrink inside of. I think she's right. If you're watching this and you've ever been the person in the family nobody expected anything from, the one who got quietly written out of holidays and conversations and futures other people assumed belonged only to them, I want you to hear this clearly. Worth was never something they had the power to decide for you. It only ever felt that way because they were loud, and you were patient. Grandmother saw 20 years of quiet Sundays and decided that patience was worth more than a lifetime of loud expectation. I hope, wherever you are, someone sees that in you too. And if they don't, I hope you learn to see it in yourself before you need anyone else to. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it moved you, let me know in the comments. Tell me if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love you first. Share this with someone who needs to hear that patience isn't weakness. There's more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.